Myths and Legends of Ancient Greece and Rome by E. M. Berens. Section 17. Third Dynasty. Night and Her Children. Horæ through Asclepius. Horæ, seasons. Closely allied to the Graces were the Horæ, or seasons, who were also represented as three beautiful maidens, daughters of Zeus and Themis. Their names were Eunomia, Dice, and Irene. It may appear strange that these divinities, presiding over the seasons, should be but three in number, but this is quite in accordance with the notions of the ancient Greeks, who only recognized spring, summer, and autumn as seasons, nature being supposed to be wrapped in death or slumber during that cheerless and unproductive portion of the year which we call winter. In some parts of Greece there were but two Horæ, Thallo, goddess of the bloom, and Carpo of the corn and fruit-bearing season. The Horæ are always regarded as friendly towards mankind, and totally devoid of guile or subtlety. They are represented as joyous but gentle maidens, crowned with flowers, and holding each other by the hand in a round dance. When they are depicted separately, as personifications of the different seasons, the Hora representing spring appears laden with flowers, that of summer bears a sheaf of corn, whilst the personification of autumn has her hands filled with clusters of grapes and other fruits. They also appear in company with the Graces, in the train of Aphrodite, and are seen with Apollo and the Muses. They are inseparably connected with all that is good and beautiful in nature, and as the regular alternation of the seasons, like all her other operations, demands the most perfect order and regularity, the Horæ, being the daughters of Themis, came to be regarded as the representatives of order and the just administration of human affairs in civilized communities. Each of these graceful maidens took upon herself a separate function. Eunomia presided more especially over state life. Dice guarded the interests of individuals, whilst Irene, the gayest and brightest of the three sisters, was the light-hearted companion of Dionysus. The Horæ were also the deities of the fast fleeting hours, and thus presided over the smaller as well as the larger divisions of time. In this capacity they assist every morning in yoking the celestial horses to the glorious chariot of the sun, which they again help to unyoke when he sinks to rest. In their original conception they were personifications of the clouds, and are described as opening and closing the gates of heaven, and causing fruits and flowers to spring forth when they pour down upon them their refreshing and life-giving streams. The Nymphs. The graceful beings called the Nymphs were the presiding deities of the woods, grottos, streams, meadows, etc. These divinities were supposed to be beautiful maidens of fairy-like form, and robed in more or less shadowy garments. They were held in the greatest veneration, though being minor divinities they had no temples dedicated to them, but were worshipped in caves or grottos, with libations of milk, honey, oil, etc. They may be divided into three distinct classes, viz. Water, mountain, and tree or wood nymphs. Water nymphs. Oceanides, Nereides, and Naiades. The worship of water deities is common to most primitive nations. The streams, springs, and fountains of a country bear the same relation to it which the blood coursing through the numberless arteries of a human being bears to the body. Both represent the living, moving, life-awakening element, without which existence would be impossible. Hence we find among most nations a deep feeling of attachment to the streams and waters of their native land, the remembrance of which, when absent in foreign climes, is always treasured with peculiar fondness. Thus among the early Greeks, each tribe came to regard the rivers and springs of its individual state as beneficent powers, which brought blessing and prosperity to the country. It is probable also that the charm which ever accompanies the sound of running water exercised its power over their imagination. They heard with delight the gentle whisper of the fountain, lulling the senses with its low rippling tones, the soft purling of the brook as it rushes over the pebbles, or the mighty voice of the waterfall as it dashes on its headlong course, and the beings which they pictured to themselves as presiding over all these charming sights and sounds of nature corresponded in their graceful appearance with the scenes with which they were associated. Oceanides. The Oceanides, or ocean nymphs, were the daughters of Oceanus and Tethys, and, like most sea divinities, were endowed with the gift of prophecy. They are personifications of those delicate vapour-like exhalations which, in warm climates, are emitted from the surface of the sea, more especially at sunset, and are impelled forwards by the evening breeze. They are accordingly represented as misty, shadowy beings, with graceful swaying forms, and robed in pale blue gauze-like fabrics. The Nereides. The Nereides were the daughters of Nereus and Doris, and were nymphs of the Mediterranean Sea. They are similar in appearance to the Oceanides, but their beauty is of a less shadowy order, and is more like that of mortals. They wear a flowing pale green robe. Their liquid eyes resemble in their clear depths the lucid waters of the sea they inhabit. Their hair floats carelessly over their shoulders, and assumes the greenish tint of the water itself, which, far from deteriorating from their beauty, greatly adds to its effect. The Nereides either accompany the chariot of the mighty ruler of the sea, or follow in his train. They are told by the poets that the lonely mariner watches the Nereides with silent awe and wondering delight, as they rise from their grotto palaces in the deep, and dance in joyful groups over the sleeping waves. Some, with arms entwined, follow with their movements the melodies which seem to hover over the sea, whilst others scatter liquid gems around, these being emblematical of the phosphorescent light so frequently observed at night by the traveller in southern waters. The best known of the Nereides were Thetis, the wife of Peleus, Amphitrite, the spouse of Poseidon, and Galatea, the beloved of Acis. The Naiades. The Naiades were the nymphs of freshwater springs, lakes, brooks, rivers, etc. As the trees, plants, and flowers owed their nourishment to their genial fostering care, these divinities were regarded by the Greeks as special benefactors to mankind. Like all the nymphs, they possessed the gift of prophecy, for which reason many of the springs and fountains over which they presided were believed to inspire mortals who drank of their waters with the power of foretelling future events. The Naiades are intimately connected in idea with those flowers which are called after them nymphae, or water lilies, whose broad green leaves and yellow cups float upon the surface of the water, as though proudly conscious of their own grace and beauty. We often hear of the Naiades forming alliances with mortals, and also of their being wooed by the sylvan deities of the woods and dales. Dryads, or tree nymphs. The tree nymphs partook of the distinguishing characteristics of the particular tree to whose life they were wedded, and were known collectively by the name of the Dryads. The Hamadryads, or oak nymphs, represent, in their peculiar individuality, the quiet, self-reliant power which appears to belong essentially to the grand and lordly king of the forest. The birch nymph is a melancholy maiden with floating hair, resembling the branches of the pale and fragile-looking tree which she inhabits. The beech nymph is strong and sturdy, full of life and joyousness, and appears to give promise of faithful love and undisturbed repose, whilst her rosy cheeks, deep brown eyes, and graceful form bespeak health, vigour, and vitality. The nymph of the linden tree is represented as a little coy maiden, whose short silver-grey dress reaches a little below the knee, and displays to advantage her delicately formed limbs. The sweet face, which is partly averted, reveals a pair of large blue eyes, which appear to look at you with wondering surprise and shy mistrust. Her pale golden hair is bound by the faintest streak of rose-coloured ribbon. The tree nymph, being wedded to the life of the tree she inhabited, ceased to exist when it was either felled or so injured as to wither away and die. Nymphs of the valleys and mountains. Napææ and Oreades. The Napææ were the kind and gentle nymphs of the valleys and glens who appear in the train of Artemis. They are represented as lovely maidens with short tunics, which, reaching only to the knee, do not impede their swift and graceful movements in the exercise of the chase. Their pale brown tresses are fastened in a knot at the back of the head, whence a few stray curls escape over their shoulders. The Napææ are shy as the fawns, and quiet as frolicsome. The Oreades, or mountain nymphs, who are the principal and constant companions of Artemis, are tall, graceful maidens, attired as huntresses. They are ardent followers of the chase, and spare neither the gentle deer nor the timid hare, nor indeed any animal they meet within their rapid course. Wherever their wild hunt goes, the shy Napææ are represented as hiding behind the leaves, whilst their favourites, the fawns, kneel tremblingly beside them, looking up beseechingly for protection from the wild huntresses, and even the bold satyrs dart away at their approach and seek safety in flight. There is a myth connected with one of these mountain nymphs, the unfortunate Echo. She became enamoured of a beautiful youth named Narcissus, son of the river god Cephissus, who, however, failed to return her love, which so grieved her that she gradually pined away, becoming a mere shadow of her former self, till at length nothing remained of her except her voice, which henceforth gave back with unerring fidelity every sound that was uttered in the hills and dales. Narcissus himself also met with an unhappy fate, for Aphrodite punished him by causing him to fall in love with his own image, which he beheld in a neighbouring fountain, whereupon, consumed with unrequited love, he wasted away, and was changed into a flower which bears his name. The Limenaeades, or meadow nymphs, resemble the Naiades, and are usually represented dancing hand in hand in a circle. The Hyades, who in appearance are somewhat similar to the Oceanides, are cloudy divinities, and, from the fact of their being invariably accompanied by rain, are represented as incessantly weeping. The Meliades were the nymphs who presided over fruit trees. Before concluding this subject, attention should be drawn to the fact that, in more modern times, this beautiful idea of animating all nature in detail reappears under the various local traditions extant in different countries. Thus do the Oceanides and Nereides live again in the mermaids, whose existence is still believed in by mariners, whilst the flower and the meadow nymphs assume the shape of those tiny elves and fairies, who were formerly believed to hold their midnight revels in every wood and on every common. Indeed, even at the present day, the Irish peasantry, especially in the West, firmly believe in the existence of the fairies, or good people, as they are called. The winds. According to the oldest accounts, Aeolus was a king of the Aeolian islands, to whom Zeus gave the command of the winds, which he kept shut up in a deep cave, and which he freed at his pleasure or at the command of the gods. In later times the above belief underwent a change, and the winds came to be regarded as distinct divinities, whose aspect accorded with the respective winds with which they were identified. They were depicted as winged youths in full vigour in the act of flying through the air. The principal winds were Boreas, the north wind; Eurus, the east wind; Zephyrus, the west wind; and Notus, the south wind, who were said to be the children of Eos and Astraeus. There are no myths of interest connected with these divinities. Zephyrus was united to Chloris, Flora, the goddess of flowers. Of Boreas it is related that, while flying over the river Ilissus, he beheld on the banks Oreithyia, the charming daughter of Erechtheus, king of Athens, whom he carried off to his native Thrace, and there made her his bride. Boreas and Oreithyia were the parents of Zetes and Calais, afterwards famous in the expedition of the Argonauts. There was an altar erected at Athens in honour of Boreas, in commemoration of his having destroyed the Persian fleet sent to attack the Greeks. On the Acropolis at Athens there was a celebrated octagonal temple built by Pericles, which was dedicated to the winds, and on its sides were their various representations. The ruins of this temple are still to be seen. Pan, Faunus. Pan was the god of fertility, and the special patron of shepherds and huntsmen. He presided over all rural occupations, was chief of the satyrs, and head of all rural divinities. According to the common belief, he was the son of Hermes and a wood nymph, and came into the world with horns sprouting from his forehead, a goat's beard and a crooked nose, pointed ears, and the tail and feet of a goat, and presented altogether so repulsive an appearance that, at the sight of him, his mother fled in dismay. Hermes, however, took up his curious little offspring, wrapped him in a hareskin, and carried him in his arms to Olympus. The grotesque form and merry antics of the little stranger made him a great favourite with all the immortals, especially Dionysus, and they bestowed upon him the name of Pan, all because he had delighted them all. His favourite haunts were grottos, and his delight was to wander in uncontrolled freedom over rocks and mountains, following his various pursuits, ever cheerful and usually very noisy. He was a great lover of music, singing, dancing, and all pursuits which enhance the pleasures of life, and hence, in spite of his repulsive appearance, we see him surrounded with nymphs of the forests and dales, who loved to dance round him to the cheerful music of his pipe, the syrinx. The myth concerning the origin of Pan's pipe is as follows. Pan became enamoured of a beautiful nymph called Syrinx, who, appalled at his terrible appearance, fled from the pertinacious attentions of her unwelcome suitor. He pursued her to the banks of the river Ladon, when, seeing his near approach, and feeling escape impossible, she called on the gods for assistance, who, in answer to her prayer, transformed her into a reed just as Pan was about to seize her. Whilst the lovesick Pan was sighing and lamenting his unfortunate fate, the winds gently swayed the reeds, and produced a murmuring sound as of one complaining. Charmed with the soothing tones, he endeavoured to reproduce them himself, and after cutting 7 of the reeds of unequal length, he joined them together, and succeeded in producing the pipe, which he called the Syrinx, in memory of his lost love. Pan was regarded by shepherds as their most valiant protector, who defended their flocks from the attacks of wolves. The shepherds of these early times have no penfolds, were in the habit of gathering together their flocks in mountain caves, to protect them against the inclemency of the weather, and also to secure them at night against the attacks of wild animals. These caves, therefore, which were very numerous in the mountain districts of Arcadia, Boeotia, etc., were all consecrated to Pan. As it is customary in all tropical climates to repose during the heat of the day, Pan is represented as greatly enjoying his afternoon sleep in the cool shelter of a tree or cave, and also as being highly displeased at any sound which disturbed his slumbers, for which reason the shepherds were always particularly careful to keep unbroken silence during these hours, whilst they themselves indulged in a quiet siesta. Pan was usually beloved by huntsmen, being himself a great lover of the woods, which afforded to his cheerful and active disposition full scope, and in which he loved to range at will. He was regarded as the patron of the chase, and the rural sportsmen, returning from an unsuccessful day's sport, beat, in token of their displeasure, the wooden image of Pan, which always occupied a prominent place in their dwellings. All sudden and unaccountable sounds which startle travellers in lonely spots were attributed to Pan, who possessed a frightful and most discordant voice, hence the term panic terror, to indicate sudden fear. The Athenians ascribed their victory at Marathon to the alarm which he created among the Persians by his terrible voice. Pan was gifted with the power of prophecy, which he is said to have imparted to Apollo, and he possessed a well-known and very ancient oracle in Arcadia, in which state he was more especially worshipped. The artists of later times have somewhat toned down the original very unattractive conception of Pan, as above described, and merely represent him as a young man hardened by the exposure to all weathers which a rural life involves, and bearing in his hand the shepherd's crook and syrinx, these being his usual attributes, whilst small horns project from his forehead. He is either undraped, or wears merely a light cloak called the chlamys. The usual offerings to Pan were milk and honey in shepherds' bowls. Cows, lambs, and rams were also sacrificed to him. After the introduction of Pan into the worship of Dionysus, we hear of a number of little Pans, Panici, who are sometimes confounded with the Satyrs. Faunus. The Romans had an old Italian divinity called Faunus, who, as the god of shepherds, was identified with the Greek Pan, and represented in a similar manner. Faunus is frequently called Inuus, or the fertilizer, and Lupercus, or the one who wards off wolves. Like Pan, he possessed the gift of prophecy, and was the presiding spirit of the woods and fields. He also shared with his Greek prototype the faculty of alarming travellers in solitary places. Bad dreams and evil apparitions were attributed to Faunus, and he was believed to enter houses stealthily at night for this purpose. Fauna was the wife of Faunus, and participated in his functions. The Satyrs. The Satyrs were a race of woodland spirits, who evidently personified the free, wild, and untrammelled life of the forest. Their appearance was both grotesque and repulsive. They had flat, broad noses, pointed ears, and little horns sprouting from their foreheads, a rough, shaggy skin, and small goats' tails. They led a life of pleasure and self-indulgence, followed the chase, revelled in every description of wild music and dancing, were terrible wine-bibbers, and addicted to the deep slumbers which follow heavy potations. They were no less dreaded by mortals than by the gentle woodland nymphs, who always avoided their coarse, rough sports. The Satyrs were conspicuous figures in the train of Dionysus, and, as we have seen, Silenus, their chief, was tutor to the wine god. The older Satyrs were called Silens, and are represented in antique sculpture as more nearly approaching the human form. In addition to the ordinary satyrs, artists delighted in depicting little satyrs, young imps, frolicking about the woods in a marvellous variety of droll attitudes. These little fellows greatly resemble their friends and companions, the Panisci. In rural districts it was customary for the shepherds and peasants who attended the festivals of Dionysus to dress themselves in the skins of goats and other animals, and under this disguise they permitted themselves all kinds of playful tricks and excesses, to which circumstance the conception of the satyrs is by some authorities attributed. In Rome, the old Italian wood divinities, the Fauns, who had goats' feet and all other characteristics of the satyrs greatly exaggerated, were identified with them. Priapus. Priapus, the son of Dionysus and Aphrodite, was regarded as the god of fruitfulness, the protector of flocks, sheep, goats, bees, the fruit of the vine, and all garden produce. His statues, which were set up in gardens and vineyards, acted not only as objects of worship, but also as scarecrows, the appearance of this god being especially repulsive and unsightly. These statues were formed of wood or stone, and from the hips downwards were merely rude columns. They represent him as having a red and very ugly face. He bears in his hand a pruning knife, and his head is crowned with a wreath of vine and laurel. He usually carries fruit in his garments, or a cornucopia in his hand, always, however, retaining his singularly revolting aspect. It is said that Hera, wishing to punish Aphrodite, sent her this misshapen and unsightly son, and that when he was born his mother was so horrified at the sight of him that she ordered him to be exposed on the mountains, where he was found by some shepherds, who, taking pity on him, saved his life. This divinity was chiefly worshipped at Lampsacus, his birthplace. Asses were sacrificed to him, and he received the first fruits of the fields and gardens, with a libation of milk and honey. The worship of Priapus was introduced into Rome at the same time as that of Aphrodite, and was identified with a native Italian divinity named Mercunus. Asclepius. Aesculapius. Asclepius, the son of the healing art, was the son of Apollo and the nymph Coronis. He was educated by the noble centaur Chiron, who instructed him in all knowledge, but more especially in that of the properties of herbs. Asclepius searched out the hidden powers of plants, and discovered cures for the various diseases which afflict the human body. He brought his art to such perfection that he not only succeeded in warding off death, but also restored the dead to life. It was popularly believed that he was materially assisted in his wonderful cures by the blood of the Medusa, given to him by Pallas Athene. It is well to observe that the shrines of this divinity, which were usually built in healthy places, on hills outside the town, or near wells which were believed to have healing powers, offered at the same time means of cure for the sick and suffering, thus combining religious with sanitary influences. It was the custom for the sufferer to sleep in the temple, when, if he had been earnest in his devotions, Asclepius appeared to him in a dream, and revealed the means to be employed for the cure of his malady. On the walls of these temples were hung tablets, inscribed by the different pilgrims with the particulars of their maladies, the remedies practised, and the cures worked by the god, a custom undoubtedly productive of most beneficial results. Groves, temples, and altars were dedicated to Asclepius in many parts of Greece, but Epidaurus, the chief seat of his worship, where indeed it is said to have originated, contained his principal temple, which served at the same time as a hospital. The statue of Asclepius in the temple at Epidaurus was formed of ivory and gold, and represented him as an old man with a full beard, leaning on a staff, round which a serpent is climbing. The serpent was the distinguishing symbol of this divinity, partly because these reptiles were greatly used by the ancients in the cure of diseases, and partly also because all the prudence and wisdom of the serpent were deemed indispensable to the judicious physician. His usual attributes are a staff, a bowl, a bunch of herbs, a pineapple, a dog, and a serpent. His children inherited, for the most part, the distinguished talents of their father. Two of his sons, Machaon and Podalirius, accompanied Agamemnon to the Trojan War, in which expedition they became renowned not only as military heroes, but also as skilful physicians. Their sisters, Hygeia, health, and Panacea, or healing, had temples dedicated to them, and received divine honours. The function of Hygeia was to maintain the health of the community, which great blessing was supposed to be brought by her as a direct and beneficent gift from the gods. Aesculapius. The worship of Aesculapius was introduced into Rome from Epidaurus, whence the statue of the god of healing was brought at the time of a great pestilence. Grateful for their deliverance from this plague, the Romans erected a temple in his honour on an island near the mouth of the Tiber. End of section 17.
Section 18 of Myths and Legends. Roman divinities. Janus. From the earliest ages, Janus was regarded by the Romans with the utmost affection and veneration, as a divinity who ranked only second to Jupiter himself, and through whom all prayers and petitions were transmitted to the other gods. He was believed to preside over the beginnings of all things, hence it was he who inaugurated the years, months, and seasons, and in course of time came to be considered as specially protecting the beginnings of all human enterprises. The great importance which the Romans attached to an auspicious commencement, as contributing to the ultimate success of an enterprise, accounts for the high estimation in which Janus was held as the god of beginnings. This divinity would appear to have been the ancient sun god of the Italian tribes, in which capacity he opens and closes the gates of heaven every morning and evening. Hence he was regarded as the doorkeeper of heaven, and also as the presiding deity over all gates, entrances, etc. on earth. The fact of his being the god of city gates, which were called Jani after him, is ascribed, however, to the following myth. After the abduction of their women by the Romans, the Sabines, in revenge, invaded the Roman state, and were already about to enter the gates of the city, when suddenly a hot sulphur spring, which was believed to have been sent by Janus for their special preservation, gushed forth from the earth and arrested the progress of the enemy. See footnote 179. In his character as guardian of gates and doors, he was also regarded as a protecting deity of the home, for which reason little shrines were erected to him over the doors of houses, which contained an image of the god having two faces. Janus possessed no temples in the ordinary acceptation of the word, but all the gates of cities were dedicated to him. Close to the Forum of Rome stood the so-called Temple of Janus, which, however, was merely an arched passage closed by massive gates. This temple was only open in time of war, as it was supposed that the god had then taken his departure with the Roman army, over whose welfare he personally presided. It is worthy of notice, as an evidence of the many wars in which the Romans were engaged, that the gates of this sanctuary were only closed 3 times during 700 years. As the god who ushers in the new year, the first month was called after him, and on the 1st of January his most important festival was celebrated, on which occasion all entrances of public and private buildings were decorated with laurel branches and garlands of flowers. His sacrifices, consisting of cakes, wine, and barley, were offered to him at the beginning of every month, and before sacrificing to the other gods his name was always invoked, and a libation poured out to him. Janus is usually represented with two faces. In his special function as doorkeeper of heaven, he stands erect, bearing a key in one hand and a rod or scepter in the other. It is supposed that Janus was the most ancient king of Italy, who during his life governed his subjects with such wisdom and moderation that in gratitude for the benefits conferred upon them, his people deified him after death and placed him in the foremost rank among their divinities. We have already seen in the history of Cronus that Saturn, who was identified with the Greek Cronus, god of time, was the friend and colleague of Janus. Anxious to prove his gratitude to his benefactor, Cronus endowed him with the knowledge of past and future events. See footnote 180, which enabled him to adopt the wisest measures for the welfare of his subjects, and it is on this account that Janus is represented with two faces looking in opposite directions, the one to the past, the other to the future. Flora. Flora was the goddess of flowers, and was regarded as a beneficent power who watched over and protected the early blossoms. She was held in the highest estimation by the Romans, and a festival called the Floralia was celebrated in her honor from the 28th of April to the 1st of May. This festival was a season of universal merriment, in which flowers were used profusely in adorning houses, streets, etc., and were worn by young girls in their hair. Flora, who typified the season of spring, is generally represented as a lovely maiden garlanded with flowers. Robigus. In opposition to Flora, we find an antagonistic divinity called Robigus, a worker of evil who delighted in the destruction of the tender herbs by mildew, and whose wrath could only be averted by prayers and sacrifices when he was invoked under the title of Averuncus, or the Avertor. The festival of Robigus, the Robigalia, was celebrated on the 25th of April. Pomona. Pomona was the goddess of orchards and fruit trees, who, according to Ovid, cares not for woods or streams, but loves her gardens and the boughs that bear the thriving fruit. Pomona, who typifies autumn, is represented as a lovely maiden laden with branches of fruit trees. See footnote 181. Vertumnus. Vertumnus was the god of garden and field produce. He personifies the change of seasons, and that process of transformation in nature by means of which the leaf buds become developed into blossoms, and the blossoms into fruit. The change of seasons is symbolized in a myth which represents Vertumnus as metamorphosing himself into a variety of different forms in order to gain the affection of Pomona, who so loved her vocation that she abjured all thoughts of marriage. He first appears to her as a ploughman, typifying spring, then as a reaper, to represent summer, afterwards as a vine-gatherer, to indicate autumn, and finally as a gray-haired old woman, symbolical of the snows of winter. But it was not until he assumed his true form, that of a beautiful youth, that he succeeded in his suit. Vertumnus is generally represented crowned with wheat sheaves and bearing in his hand a cornucopia. Pales. Pales, a very ancient Italian divinity, is represented sometimes as a male, sometimes as a female power. As a male divinity, he is more particularly the god of shepherds and flocks. As a female deity, Pales presides over husbandry and the fruitfulness of herds. Her festivals, the Palilia, were celebrated on the 21st of April, the day on which the city of Rome was founded. During this festival it is customary for shepherds to ignite a mass of straw, through which they rushed with their flocks, believing that this ordeal would purify them from sin. The name Palatine, which originally signified a pastoral colony, is derived from this divinity. Her offerings were cakes and milk. See footnote 182. Picus. Picus, the son of Saturn and father of Faunus, was a woodland divinity gifted with prophetic powers. An ancient myth relates that Picus was a beautiful youth united to a nymph called Canons. The sorceress Circe, infatuated by his beauty, endeavored to secure his love, but he rejected her advances, and she, in revenge, changed him to a woodpecker, under which form he still retained his powers of prophecy. Picus is represented as a youth, with a woodpecker perched upon his head, which bird became henceforth regarded as possessed of the power of prophecy. Picumnus and Pilumnus. Picumnus and Pilumnus were two household divinities of the Romans who were the special presiding deities of newborn infants. Silvanus. Silvanus was a woodland divinity who, like Faunus, greatly resembled the Greek Pan. He was the presiding deity of plantations and forests, and specially protected the boundaries of fields. Silvanus is represented as a hale old man, carrying a cypress tree, for according to Roman mythology, the transformation of the youth Cyparissus into the tree which bears his name was attributed to him. His sacrifices consisted of milk, meat, wine, grapes, wheat ears, and pigs. Terminus. Terminus was the god who presided over all boundaries and landmarks. He was originally represented by a simple block of stone, which in later times became surmounted by a head of this divinity. See footnote 183. Numa Pompilius, the great benefactor of his people, anxious to inculcate respect for the rights of property, specially enjoined the erection of these blocks of stone as a durable monument to mark the line dividing one property from another. He also caused altars to be raised to Terminus, and instituted his festival, the Terminalia, which was celebrated on the 23rd of February. Upon one occasion, when Tarquin wished to remove the altars of several deities in order to build a new temple, it is said that Terminus and Juventus alone objected to being displaced. This obstinate refusal on their part was interpreted as a good omen, signifying that the city of Rome would never lose her boundaries and would remain ever young and vigorous. Consus. Consus was the god of secret counsel. The Romans believed that when an idea developed itself spontaneously within the mind of an individual, it was Consus who had prompted the suggestion. This applied, however, more particularly to plans which resulted satisfactorily. An altar was erected to this divinity on the Circus Maximus, which was kept always covered, except during his festival, the Consualia, which was celebrated on the 18th of August. Libitina. Libitina was the goddess who presided over funerals. This divinity was identified with Venus, possibly because the ancients considered that the power of love extended even to the realms of death. Her temple in Rome, which was erected by Servius Tullius, contained all the requisites for funerals, and these could either be bought or hired there. A register of all deaths which occurred in the city of Rome was kept in this temple, and in order to ascertain the rate of mortality, a piece of money was paid, by command of Servius Tullius, on the demise of each person. See footnote 184. Laverna. Laverna was the presiding goddess of thieves, and of all artifice and fraud. There was an altar erected to her near the Porta Lavernalis, which was called after her, and she possessed a sacred grove on the Via Salavia. Comus. Comus was the presiding genius of banquets, festive scenes, revelry, and all joyous pleasures and reckless gaiety. He is represented as a young man crowned with flowers, his face heated and flushed with wine, leaning against a post in a half-sleepy and drunken attitude, with a torch falling from his hand. The Caemenae. The Caemenae were prophetic nymphs held in high veneration by the ancient Italians. They were 4 in number, the best known of whom are Carmenta and Egeria. Carmenta was celebrated as being the mother of Evander, who led an Arcadian colony into Italy and founded a town on the river Tiber, which became afterwards incorporated with the city of Rome. Evander is said to have been the first who introduced Greek art and civilization into Italy, and also the worship of Greek divinities. A temple was erected to Carmenta on the Capitoline Hill, and a festival, called the Carmentalia, was celebrated in her honor on the 11th of January. Egeria is said to have initiated Numa Pompilius in the forms of religious worship which he introduced among his people. She was regarded as the giver of life, and was therefore invoked by women before the birth of their children. See footnote 185. The Caemenae are frequently identified by Roman writers with the Muses. Genii. A comforting and assuring belief existed among the Romans that each individual was accompanied through life, from the hour of his birth to that of his death, by a protecting spirit called his genius, who prompted him to good and noble deeds, and acted towards him as a guardian angel, comforting him in sorrow, and guiding him throughout his earthly career. In the course of time, a second genius was believed to exist, of an evil nature, who, as the instigator of all wrongdoing, was ever at war with the beneficent genius. And on the issue of the conflict between these antagonistic influences depended the fate of the individual. The genii were depicted as winged beings, greatly resembling our modern representations of guardian angels. Every state, town, or city, as well as every man, possessed its special genius. The sacrifices to the genii consisted of wine, cakes, and incense, which were offered to them on birthdays. The genius which guided a woman was called, after the Queen of Heaven, Juno. Among the Greeks, beings called daemons were regarded as exercising similar functions to those of the Roman genii. They were believed to be the spirits of the righteous race which existed in the Golden Age, who watched over mankind, carrying their prayers to the gods, and the gifts of the gods to them. Manes. Lemurs, larvae, and lares. The manes were the spirits of the departed, and were of two kinds, viz. Lemurs, or larvae, and lares. See footnote 186. The lemurs were those manes who haunted their former abodes on earth as evil spirits, appearing at night under awful forms and hideous shapes, greatly to the alarm of their friends and relatives. They were so feared that a festival, called the Lemuralia, was celebrated in order to propitiate them. It appears extremely probable that the superstitions with regard to ghosts, haunted houses, etc., which exist even at the present day, owe their origin to this very ancient pagan source. The lares familiares were a much more pleasing conception. They were the spirits of the ancestors of each family, who exercised after death a protecting power over the well-being and prosperity of the family to which they had in life belonged. The place of honor beside the hearth was occupied by the statue of the lar of the house, who was supposed to have been the founder of the family. This statue was the object of profound veneration, and was honored on all occasions by every member of the family. A portion of each meal was laid before it, and it was believed to take an active part in all family affairs and domestic events, whether of a sad or joyful nature. Before starting on any expedition, the master of the house saluted the statue of the lar, and on his return a solemn thanksgiving was offered to this, the presiding deity of his hearth and home, in grateful acknowledgment of his protection. Whereupon the statue was crowned with garlands of flowers, these being the favorite offerings of the lares on all occasions of especial family rejoicing. The first act of a bride on entering her new abode was to do homage to the lar, in the belief that he would exercise over her a protecting influence and shield her from evil. In addition to those above enumerated, there were also public lares, who were guardians of the state, high roads, country, and sea. Their temples were always open for any pious worshipper to enter, and on their altars public sacrifices were offered for the welfare of the state or city. See footnote 187. Penates. The penates were deities selected by each family, and frequently by its individual members, as a special protector. Various causes led to this selection. If, for instance, a child were born on the festival of Vesta, it was thought that that deity would henceforward act as its special guardian. If a youth possessed great business talents, he adopted Mercury as his tutelary deity. Should he, on the other hand, develop a passion for music, Apollo was selected as his patron god, and so forth. These became regarded as the special divinities of the household. Small images of them adorned the surroundings of the hearth, and honors similar to those paid to the lares were accorded to them. Just as there were public lares, so there were public penates, which were worshipped by the Roman people under the form of two youthful warriors, who in later times were regarded as identical with Castor and Pollux. They are generally represented on horseback, with conical caps on their heads, and bearing long spears in their hands. See footnote 188. End of section 18. Section 19 of Myths and Legends. Public worship of the ancient Greeks and Romans. Temples. In very remote times, the Greeks had no shrines or sanctuaries devoted to public worship, but performed their devotions beneath the vast and boundless canopy of heaven, in the great temple of nature itself. Believing that their divinities throned above the clouds, pious worshippers naturally sought the highest available points, in order to place themselves in the closest communion possible with their gods. Hence the summits of high mountains were selected for devotional purposes, and the more exalted the rank and importance of the divinity invoked, the more elevated was the site selected for his or her worship. But the inconvenience attending this mode of worship gradually suggested the idea of erecting edifices which would afford means of shelter from the inclemency of the weather. These structures were, in the first instance, of the most simple form, and without decoration. But when, with the progress of civilization, the Greeks became a wealthy and powerful people, see footnote 189, temples were built and adorned with the greatest splendor and magnificence, talent, labor, and wealth being lavished unsparingly on their erection and decoration. Indeed, so massively were they constructed, that some of them have, to a certain extent, withstood the ravages of time. The city of Athens especially contains numerous remains of these buildings of antiquity. On the Acropolis we may still behold, among other monuments of ancient art, the temple of Athena Polias and that of Theseus, the latter of which is the most entire ancient edifice in the world. In the island of Delos also are to be seen the ruins of the temples of Apollo and Artemis, both of which are in a wonderful state of preservation. These ruins are most valuable, being sufficiently complete to enable us to study, by their aid, the plan and character of the original structure. Among the Lacedaemonians, however, we find no vestiges of these stately temples, for they were specially enjoined by a law of Lycurgus to serve the gods with as little outlay as possible. When the great lawgiver was asked the reason of this injunction, he replied that the Lacedaemonians, being a poor nation, might otherwise abstain altogether from the observance of their religious duties, and wisely added that magnificent edifices and costly sacrifices were not so pleasing to the gods as the true piety and unfeigned devotion of their worshippers. The most ancient temples known to us served a double purpose. They were not only consecrated to the service of the gods, but were at the same time venerable monuments in honor of the dead. Thus, for instance, the temple of Pallas Athene, in the tower of the city of Larissa, served as the sepulchre of Acrisius, and the Acropolis at Athens received the ashes of Cecrops, founder of the city. A temple was frequently dedicated to two or more gods, and was always built after the manner considered most acceptable to the particular divinities to whom it was consecrated. For just as trees, birds, and animals of every description were held to be sacred to certain deities, see footnote 190, so almost every god had a form of building peculiar to himself, which was deemed more acceptable to him than any other. Thus the Doric style of architecture was sacred to Zeus, Eris, and Heracles, the Ionic to Apollo, Artemis, and Dionysus, and the Corinthian to Hestia. In the porch of the temple stood a vessel of stone or brass, containing holy water, which had been consecrated by putting into it a burning torch taken from the altar, with which all those admitted to take part in the sacrifices were besprinkled. In the inmost recess of the sanctuary was the most holy place, into which none but the priests were suffered to enter. Temples in the country were usually surrounded with groves of trees. The solitude of these shady retreats naturally tended to inspire the worshipper with awe and reverence, added to which the delightful shade and coolness afforded by tall leafy trees is peculiarly grateful in hot countries. Indeed, so general did this custom of building temples and groves become, that all places devoted to sacred purposes, even where no trees existed, were called groves. That this practice must be of very remote antiquity is provided by the biblical injunction, having for its object the separation of the Jews from all idolatrous practices, "Thou shalt not plant thee a grove of trees near unto the altar of the Lord thy God." Statues. The Greeks worshipped their gods without any visible representations of them until the time of Cecrops. The most ancient of these representations consisted of square blocks of stone, upon which the name of the deity intended to be represented was engraved. The first attempts at sculpture were rude stocks, with a head at one end and a shapeless trunk at the other, tapering slightly down to the feet, which, however, were not divided, the limbs being in no way defined. But the artists of later times devoted all their genius to the successful production of the highest ideals of their gods, some of which are preserved to this day and are regarded as examples of purest art. See footnote 191. On a pedestal in the center of the edifice stood the statue of the divinity to whom the temple was dedicated, surrounded by images of other gods, all of which were fenced off by rails. Altars. The altar in a Greek temple, which stood in the center of the building and in front of the statue of the presiding deity, was generally of a circular form and constructed of stone. It was customary to engrave upon it the name or distinguishing symbol of the divinity to whom it was dedicated, and it was held so sacred that if any malefactor fled to it, his life was saved from his pursuers, and it was considered one of the greatest acts of sacrilege to force him from this asylum. The most ancient altars were adorned with horns, which in former times were emblems of power and dignity, as wealth and consequently importance consisted among most primitive nations in flocks and herds. In addition to those erected in places of public worship, altars were frequently raised in groves, on highways, or in the marketplaces of cities. The gods of the lower world had no altars whatever, ditches or trenches being dug for the reception of the blood of the sacrifices offered to them. Priests. In ancient times, the priests were recognized as a special social caste, and were distinguished not only by their sacerdotal vestments, but also by their piety, wisdom, and blameless life. They were the chosen mediators between gods and men, and offered prayers and sacrifices in the name of the people, whom they also instructed as to what vows, gifts, and offerings would be most acceptable to the gods. See footnote 192. Every deity had a different order of priests consecrated to his worship, and in every place a high priest was appointed, whose duty it was to superintend the rest of his order, and also to carry out the more sacred rites and religious observances. Priests and priestesses were permitted to marry, but not a second time. Some, however, voluntarily adopted a life of celibacy. Sacrifices. There is no doubt that a feeling of gratitude to the gods for their protecting care, and the abundance with which they were believed to bless mankind, has induced men of all nations and in all countries to feel a desire to sacrifice to their divinities some portion of the gifts so generously lavished upon them. Among the Greeks, sacrifices were of various kinds. They consisted of free will offerings, propitiatory offerings, etc. Free will offerings were grateful acknowledgments for benefits received, and usually consisted of the first fruits of the field, or the finest of the flocks and herds, which were required to be without spot or blemish. Propitiatory offerings were brought with the object of appeasing the anger of the gods. In addition to those above enumerated, sacrifices were made, either with a view of obtaining success in an enterprise about to be undertaken, or in a fulfillment of a vow, or at the command of an oracle. Every sacrifice was accompanied by salt, and also by a libation, which usually consisted of wine, the cup being always filled to the brim, indicating that the offering was made without stint. When sacrificing to the infernal gods, the cup containing the libation was filled with blood. The animals offered to the Olympian divinities were white, whilst those to the gods of the lower world were black. When a man offered a special sacrifice for himself or his family, it partook of the nature of his occupation. See footnote 193. Thus a shepherd brought a sheep, a vine grower his grapes, and so forth. But in the case of public sacrifices, the supposed individuality of the deity was always consulted. For instance, to Demeter a sow was offered because that animal is apt to root up the seed corn. To Dionysus a goat, on account of its being destructive to vineyards, etc. The value of offerings depended greatly upon the position of the individual, it being regarded as a contempt of the gods for a rich man to bring a sordid offering, whilst from a poor man the smallest oblation was considered acceptable. Hecatombs consisted of 100 animals, and were offered by entire communities or by wealthy individuals who either deserved or had obtained some special favor from the gods. When a sacrifice was to be offered, a fire was kindled on the altar, into which wine and frankincense were poured, in order to increase the flame. In very ancient times the victim was laid upon the altar and burned whole, but after the time of Prometheus, portions only of the shoulders, thighs, entrails, etc. were sacrificed, the remainder becoming the perquisites of the priests. The officiating priests wore a crown composed of the leaves of the tree sacred to the deity they invoked. Thus, when sacrificing to Apollo, the crowns were of laurel, when to Heracles of poplar. This practice of wearing crowns was, at a later period, adopted by the general public at banquets and other festivities. On occasions of special solemnity, the horns of the victim were overlaid with gold, and the altars decked with flowers and sacred herbs. The mode of conducting the sacrifices was as follows. All things being prepared, a salt cake, a sacrificial knife, and the crowns were placed in a small basket and carried to the sanctuary by a young maiden, whereupon the victim was conducted into the temple, frequently to the accompaniment of music. If a small animal, it was driven loose to the altar. If a large one, it was led by a long trailing rope, in order to indicate that it was not an unwilling sacrifice. See footnote 194. When all were assembled, the priest, after walking in solemn state round the altar, besprinkled it with a mixture of meal and holy water, after which he also besprinkled the assembled worshippers, and exhorted them to join with him in prayer. The service being ended, the priest first tasted the libation, and after causing the congregation to do the like, poured the remainder between the horns of the victim, after which frankincense was strewn upon the altar, and a portion of the meal and water poured upon the animal, which was then killed. If by any chance the victim escaped the stroke, or became in any way restless, it was regarded as an evil omen. If, on the contrary, it expired without a struggle, it was considered auspicious. At the sacrifices to the aerial divinities music was added, whilst dances were performed round the altar, and sacred hymns sung. These hymns were generally composed in honor of the gods, and contained an account of their famous actions, their clemency and beneficence, and the gifts conferred by them on mankind. In conclusion, the gods were invoked for a continuance of their favor, and when the service was ended, a feast was held. Oracles. The desire to penetrate the dark veil of futurity, and thereby to avert, if possible, threatened danger, has animated mankind in all ages of the world. Prophetic knowledge was sought by the Greeks at the mouth of oracles, whose predictions were interpreted to the people by priests, specially appointed for the purpose. The most famous of these institutions was the oracle of Apollo at Delphi, which was held in general repute all over the world. People flocked from far and near to consult this wonderful mouthpiece of the gods, 1 month in the year being specially set apart for the purpose. See footnote 195. The priestess who delivered the oracles was called the Pythia, after the serpent Python which was killed by Apollo. Having first bathed in the waters of the Castalian spring, she was conducted into the temple by the priests, and was seated on a sort of 3-legged stool or table called a tripod, which was placed over the mouth of a cave, whence issued sulphurous vapours. Here she gradually became affected in a remarkable manner, and fell into an ecstatic condition, in which she uttered wild and extraordinary phrases, which were held to be the utterance of Apollo himself. These the priests interpreted to the people, but in most cases in so ambiguous a manner that the fulfillment of the prediction could not easily be disputed. During the ceremony, clouds of incense filled the temple and hid the priestess from the view of the uninitiated, and at its conclusion she was reconducted in a fainting condition to her cell. The following is a striking instance of the ambiguity of oracular predictions. Croesus, the rich king of Lydia, before going to war with Cyrus, king of Persia, consulted an oracle as to the probable success of the expedition. The reply he received was that if he crossed a certain river, he would destroy a great empire. Interpreting the response as being favorable to his design, Croesus crossed the river and encountered the Persian king, by whom he was entirely defeated, and his own empire being destroyed, the prediction of the oracle was said to have been fulfilled. Soothsayers, augurs. In addition to the manifestation of the will of the gods by means of oracles, the Greeks also believed that certain men, called soothsayers, were gifted with the power of foretelling future events from dreams, from observing the flight of birds, the entrails of sacrificed animals, and even the direction of the flames and smoke from the altar, etc. See footnote 196. Augurs. The Roman soothsayers were called augurs, and played an important part in the history of the Romans, as no enterprise was ever undertaken without first consulting them with regard to its ultimate success. Festivals. Festivals were instituted as seasons of rest, rejoicing, and thanksgiving, and also as anniversaries to commemorate events of national importance. The most ancient festivals were those held after the ingathering of the harvest or vintage, and were celebrated with rejoicings and merrymakings, which lasted many days, during which time the first fruits of the fields were offered to the gods, accompanied by prayers and thanksgiving. The festivals held in cities in honor of special divinities, or in commemoration of particular events, were conducted with an elaborate ceremonial. Gorgeous processions, games, chariot races, etc., were conspicuous features on these occasions, and dramatic performances, representing particular episodes in the lives of the gods and heroes, frequently took place. We subjoin a few of the most interesting of the Greek and Roman festivals. End of Section 19.
Section 20 of Myths and Legends. Greek Festivals. Eleusinian Mysteries. One of the most ancient and important among the festivals observed by the Greeks was that of the Eleusinian Mysteries, which was celebrated in honor of Demeter and Persephone. The name was derived from Eleusis, a town in Attica, where the mysteries were first introduced by the goddess herself. They were divided into the greater and lesser mysteries, and, according to the general account, were held every 5 years. The greater, which were celebrated in honor of Demeter, and lasted 9 days, were held in autumn. The lesser, dedicated to Persephone, who at these festivals was affectionately called Cora, or the Maiden, were held in spring. It is supposed that the secrets taught to the initiated by the priests, the expounders of the mysteries, were moral meanings, elucidated from the myths concerning Demeter and Persephone, but the most important belief inculcated was the doctrine of the immortality of the soul. That the lessons taught were of the highest moral character is universally admitted. The souls of those who participated in them were filled with the sweetest hopes both as to this and to the future world. And it was a common saying among the Athenians, "In the mysteries no one is sad." The initiation into these solemn rites, which was originally the exclusive privilege of the Athenians, was accompanied with awe-inspiring ceremonies, and secrecy was so strictly enjoined that its violation was punished by death. At the conclusion of the initiation great rejoicings took place. Chariot races, wrestling matches, etc., were held, and solemn sacrifices offered. The initiation into the lesser mysteries served as a preparation for the greater. Thesmophoria. The Thesmophoria was another festival held in honor of Demeter, in her character as presiding over marriage and social institutions resulting from the spread of agriculture. This festival was celebrated exclusively by women. Dionysia. A joyous spring festival was held in honor of Dionysius in the month of March and lasted several days. This festival, which was called the Greater Dionysia, was celebrated with a particular splendor at Athens, when strangers flocked from all parts of the world to take part in the ceremonies. The city was gaily decorated, the houses were garlanded with ivy leaves, crowds perambulated the streets, everything wore its holiday garb, and wine was freely indulged in. In the processions which took place during these festivities, the statue of Dionysus was carried, and men and women, crowned with ivy and bearing the thyrsus, were dressed in every description of grotesque costume, and played on drums, pipes, flutes, cymbals, etc. Some, representing Silenus, rode on asses; others, wearing fawn skins, appeared as Pan or the Satyrs, and the whole multitude sang paeans to the honor of the wine god. Public shows, games, and sports took place, and the entire city was full of revelry. What lent additional interest to these festivals was the custom of introducing new comedies and tragedies to the public, representations of which were given, and prizes awarded to those which elicited the greatest admiration. The lesser Dionysia were vintage festivals, celebrated in rural districts in the month of November, and were characterized by drinking, feasting, and joviality of all kinds. In connection with some of the festivals in honor of Dionysus were certain mystic observances, into which only women, called Menoetes or Bacchantes, were initiated. Clad in fawn skins, they assembled by night on the mountain sides, some carrying blazing torches, others thyrsi, and all animated with religious enthusiasm and frenzy. They shouted, clapped their hands, danced wildly, and worked themselves up to such a pitch of excitement and fury that in their mad frenzy they tore in pieces the animal brought as a sacrifice to Dionysus. Under the name of Bacchanalia, these mystic rites were introduced into Rome, where men also were allowed to participate in them, but they were attended with such frightful excesses that the state authorities at length intervened and prohibited them. Panathenaea. The Panathenaea was a famous festival celebrated in Athens in honor of Athene Polias, the guardian of the state. There were two festivals of this name, the Lesser and the Greater Panathenaea. The former was held annually, and the latter, which lasted several days, was celebrated every 4th year. For the Greater Panathenaea a garment, embroidered with the gold, called the peplus, was specially woven by Athenian maidens, on which was represented the victory gained by Athena over the giants. This garment was suspended to the mast of a ship which stood outside the city, and during the festival, which was characterized by a grand procession, the ship, with the peplus on its mast, was impelled forward by means of invisible machinery, and formed the most conspicuous feature of the pageant. The whole population, bearing olive branches in their hands, took part in the procession, and amidst music and rejoicings this imposing pageant wended its way to the temple of Athene Polias, where the peplus was deposited on the statue of the goddess. At this festival Homer's poems were declaimed aloud, and poets also introduced their own works to the public. Musical contests, foot and horse races, and wrestling matches were held, and dances were performed by boys in armor. Men who had deserved well of their country were presented at the festival with a crown of gold, and the name of the person so distinguished was announced publicly by a herald. The victors in the races and athletic games received, as a prize, a vase of oil, supposed to have been extracted from the fruit of the sacred olive tree of Athena. The Daphnephoria. The Daphnephoria was celebrated at Thebes in honor of Apollo every 9th year. The distinguishing feature of this festival was a procession to the temple of Apollo, in which a young priest, the Daphnephorus, of noble descent, splendidly attired and wearing a crown of gold, was preceded by a youth, carrying an emblematical representation of the sun, moon, stars, and days of the year, and followed by beautiful maidens bearing laurel branches and singing hymns in honor of the gods. End of section 20.
Section 21. Roman Festivals. Saturnalia. The Saturnalia, a national festival held in December in honor of Saturn, was celebrated after the ingathering of the harvest and lasted several days. It was a time of universal rejoicing, cessation from labor, and merrymaking. School children had holidays, friends sent presents to each other, the law courts were closed, and no business was transacted. Crowds of people from the surrounding country flocked to Rome for this festival, attired in every variety of masquerade dress. Practical jokes were given and received with the utmost good humour. Shouts of exultation filled the air. All classes abandoned themselves to enjoyment, and unrestrained hilarity reigned supreme. Social distinctions were for a time suspended, or even reversed. And so heartily was the spirit of this festival entered into, that masters waited upon their slaves at banquets which they provided for them, the slaves being dressed upon these occasions in the garments of their masters. There appears little doubt that the modern carnival is a survival of the ancient Saturnalia. Cerealia. This festival was celebrated in honor of Ceres. It was solemnized exclusively by women, who, dressed in white garments, wandered about with torches in their hands, to represent the search of the goddess for her daughter Proserpina. During this festival, games were celebrated in the Circus Maximus, to which none were admitted unless clothed in white. Vestalia. The Vestalia was a festival held in honor of Vesta on the 9th of June, and was celebrated exclusively by women, who walked barefooted in procession to the temple of the goddess. The priestesses of Vesta, called Vestales or Vestal Virgins, played a conspicuous part in these festivals. They were 6 in number, and were chosen between the ages of 6 and 10 from the noblest families in Rome. Their term of office was 30 years. During the first 10 years they were initiated in their religious duties, during the second 10 they performed them, and during the third they instructed novices. Their chief duty was to watch and feed the ever-burning flame on the altar of Vesta, the extinction of which was regarded as a national calamity of ominous import. Great honours and privileges were accorded to them. The best seats were reserved for their use at all public spectacles, and even the consuls and praetors made way for them to pass. If they met a criminal on his way to execution, they had the power to pardon him, provided it could be proved that the meeting was accidental. The Vestales were vowed to chastity, a violation of which was visited by the frightful punishment of being buried alive. End of section 21.
Section 22 of Myths and Legends. Legends. Cadmus. The following is the legendary account of the founding of Thebes. After the abduction of his daughter Europa by Zeus, Aegina, king of Phoenicia, unable to reconcile himself to her loss, dispatched his son Cadmus in search of her, desiring him not to return without his sister. For many years Cadmus pursued his search through various countries, but without success. Not daring to return home without her, he consulted the oracle of Apollo at Delphi, and the reply was that he must desist from his task and take upon himself a new duty, i.e. that of founding a city, the site of which would be indicated to him by a heifer which had never borne the yoke, and which would lie down on the spot whereon the city was to be built. Scarcely had Cadmus left the sacred fane, when he observed a heifer who bore no marks of servitude on her neck, walking slowly in front of him. He followed the animal for a considerable distance, until at length, on the site where Thebes afterwards stood, she looked towards heaven, and, gently lowing, lay down in the long grass. Grateful for this mark of divine favour, Cadmus resolved to offer up the animal as a sacrifice, and accordingly sent his followers to fetch water for the libation from a neighbouring spring. This spring, which was sacred to Ares, was situated in a wood, and guarded by a fierce dragon, who, at the approach of the retainers of Cadmus, suddenly pounced upon them and killed them. After waiting some time for the return of his servants, Cadmus grew impatient, and, hastily arming himself with his lance and spear, set out to seek them. On reaching the spot, the mangled remains of his unfortunate followers met his view, and near them he beheld the frightful monster, dripping with the blood of his victims. Seizing a huge rock, the hero hurled it with all his might upon the dragon, but protected by his tough black skin and steely scales as by a coat of mail, he remained unhurt. Cadmus now tried his lance, and with more success, for it pierced the side of the beast, who, furious with pain, sprang at his adversary, when Cadmus, leaping aside, succeeded in fixing the point of his spear within his jaws, which final stroke put an end to the encounter. While Cadmus stood surveying his vanquished foe, Pallas Athene appeared to him, and commanded him to sow the teeth of the dead dragon in the ground. He obeyed, and out of the furrows there arose a band of armed men, who at once commenced to fight with each other until all except 5 were killed. These last surviving warriors made peace with each other, and it was with their assistance that Cadmus now built the famous city of Thebes. In later times the noblest Theban families proudly claimed their descent from these mighty earth-born warriors. Ares was furious with rage when he discovered that Cadmus had slain his dragon, and would have killed him had not Zeus interfered and induced him to mitigate his punishment to that of servitude for the term of 8 years. At the end of that time the god of war became reconciled to Cadmus, and, in token of his forgiveness, bestowed upon him the hand of his daughter Harmonia in marriage. Their nuptials were almost as celebrated as those of Peleus and Thetis. All the gods honoured them with their presence, and offered rich gifts and congratulations. Cadmus himself presented his lovely bride with a splendid necklace fashioned by Hephaestus, which, however, after the death of Harmonia, always proved fatal to its possessor. The children of Cadmus and Harmonia were 1 son, Polydorus, and 4 daughters, Autonoe, Ino, Semele, and Agave. For many years the founder of Thebes reigned happily, but at length a conspiracy was formed against him, and he was deprived of his throne by his grandson Pentheus. Accompanied by his faithful wife Harmonia, he retired into Illyria, and after death they were both changed by Zeus into serpents and transferred to Elysium. Perseus. Perseus, one of the most renowned of the legendary heroes of antiquity, was the son of Zeus and Danae, daughter of Acrisius, king of Argos. An oracle having foretold to Acrisius that a son of Danae would be the cause of his death, he imprisoned her in a tower of brass in order to keep her secluded from the world. Zeus, however, descended through the roof of the tower in the form of a shower of gold, and the lovely Danae became his bride. For 4 years Acrisius remained in ignorance of this union, but one evening, as he chanced to pass by the brazen chamber, he heard the cry of a young child proceeding from within, which led to the discovery of his daughter's marriage with Zeus. Enraged at finding all his precautions unavailing, Acrisius commanded the mother and child to be placed in a chest and thrown into the sea. But it was not the will of Zeus that they should perish. He directed Poseidon to calm the troubled waters, and caused the chest to float safely to the island of Seriphus. Dictys, brother of Polydectes, king of the island, was fishing on the seashore when he saw the chest stranded on the beach, and pitying the helpless condition of its unhappy occupants, he conducted them to the palace of the king, where they were treated with the greatest kindness. Polydectes eventually became united to Danae, and bestowed upon Perseus an education befitting a hero. When he saw his stepson develop into a noble and manly youth, he endeavoured to instil into his mind a desire to signalize himself by the achievement of some great and heroic deed, and after mature deliberation it was decided that the slaying of the Gorgon Medusa would bring him the greatest renown. For the successful accomplishment of his object It was necessary for him to be provided with a pair of winged sandals, a magic wallet, and the helmet of Aedes, which rendered the wearer invisible, all of which were in the keeping of the nymphs, the place of whose abode was known only to the Graeae. Perseus started on his expedition, and, guided by Hermes and Pallas Athene, arrived, after a long journey, in the far-off region on the borders of Oceanus, where dwelt the Graeae, daughters of Phorcys and Ceto. He at once applied to them for the necessary information, and on their refusing to grant it, he deprived them of their single eye and tooth, which he only restored to them when they gave him full directions with regard to his route. He then proceeded to the abode of the nymphs, from whom he obtained the objects indispensable for his purpose. Equipped with the magic helmet and wallet, and armed with a sickle, the gift of Hermes, he attached to his feet the winged sandals, and flew to the abode of the Gorgons, whom he found fast asleep. Now, as Perseus had been warned by his celestial guides that whoever looked upon these weird sisters would be transformed into stone, he stood with averted face before the sleepers, and caught on his bright metal shield their triple image. Then, guided by Pallas Athene, he cut off the head of the Medusa, which he placed in his wallet. No sooner had he done so than from the headless trunk there sprang forth the winged steed Pegasus, and Chrysaor, the father of the winged giant Geryon. He now hastened to elude the pursuit of the two surviving sisters, who, aroused from their slumbers, eagerly rushed to avenge the death of their sister. His invisible helmet and winged sandals here stood him in good stead, for the former concealed him from the view of the Gorgons, whilst the latter bore him swiftly over land and sea, far beyond the reach of pursuit. In passing over the burning plains of Libya, the drops of blood from the head of the Medusa oozed through the wallet, and falling on the hot sands below, produced a brood of many-coloured snakes, which spread all over the country. Perseus continued his flight until he reached the kingdom of Atlas, of whom he begged rest and shelter. But as this king possessed a valuable orchard in which every tree bore golden fruit, he was fearful lest the slayer of the Medusa might destroy the dragon which guarded it, and then rob him of his treasures. He therefore refused to grant the hospitality which the hero demanded, whereupon Perseus, exasperated at the churlish repulse, produced from his wallet the head of the Medusa, and holding it towards the king, transformed him into a stony mountain. Beard and hair erected themselves into forests, shoulders, hands, and limbs became huge rocks, and the head grew up into a craggy peak which reached into the clouds. Perseus then resumed his travels. His winged sandals bore him over deserts and mountains until he arrived at Ethiopia, the kingdom of King Cepheus. Here he found the country inundated with disastrous floods, towns and villages destroyed, and everywhere signs of desolation and ruin. On a projecting cliff close to the shore he beheld a lovely maiden chained to a rock. This was Andromeda, the king's daughter. Her mother, Cassiopeia, having boasted that her beauty surpassed that of the Nereides, the angry sea nymphs appealed to Poseidon to avenge their wrongs, whereupon the sea god devastated the country with a terrible inundation, which brought with it a huge monster who devoured all that came in his way. In their distress the unfortunate Ethiopians applied to the oracle of Jupiter Ammon in the Libyan desert, and obtained the response that only by the sacrifice of the king's daughter to the monster could the country and people be saved. Cepheus, who was tenderly attached to his child, at first refused to listen to this dreadful proposal. But overcome at length by the prayers and solicitations of his unhappy subjects, the heart-broken father gave up his child for the welfare of his country. Andromeda was accordingly chained to a rock on the sea-shore to serve as a prey to the monster, whilst her unhappy parents bewailed her sad fate on the beach below. On being informed of the meaning of this tragic scene, Perseus proposed to Cepheus to slay the dragon on condition that the lovely victim should become his bride. Overjoyed at the prospect of Andromeda's release, the king gladly acceded to the stipulation, and Perseus hastened to the rock to breathe words of hope and comfort to the trembling maiden. Then, assuming once more the helmet of Aedes, he mounted into the air and awaited the approach of the monster. Presently the sea opened, and the shark's head of the gigantic beast of the deep raised itself above the waves. Lashing his tail furiously from side to side, he leapt forward to seize his victim. But the gallant hero, watching his opportunity, suddenly darted down, and producing the head of the Medusa from his wallet, held it before the eyes of the dragon, whose hideous body became gradually transformed into a huge black rock, which remained for ever a silent witness of the miraculous deliverance of Andromeda. Perseus then led the maiden to her now happy parents, who, anxious to evince their gratitude to her deliverer, ordered immediate preparations to be made for the nuptial feast. But the young hero was not to bear away his lovely bride uncontested, for in the midst of the banquet Phineus, the king's brother, to whom Andromeda had previously been betrothed, returned to claim his bride. Followed by a band of armed warriors, he forced his way into the hall, and a desperate encounter took place between the rivals, which might have terminated fatally for Perseus had he not suddenly bethought himself of the Medusa's head. Calling to his friends to avert their faces, he drew it from his wallet and held it before Phineus and his formidable bodyguard, whereupon they all stiffened into stone. Perseus now took leave of the Ethiopian king, and, accompanied by his beautiful bride, returned to Seriphus, where a joyful meeting took place between Danae and her son. He then sent a messenger to his grandfather, informing him that he intended returning to Argos. But Acrisius, fearing the fulfilment of the oracular prediction, fled for protection to his friend Teutemias, king of Larissa. Anxious to induce the aged monarch to return to Argos, Perseus followed him thither. But here a strange fatality occurred. Whilst taking part in some funereal games celebrated in honour of the king's father, Perseus, by an unfortunate throw of the discus, accidentally struck his grandfather, and thereby was the innocent cause of his death. After celebrating the funereal rites of Acrisius with due solemnity, Perseus returned to Argos, but feeling loath to occupy the throne of one whose death he had caused, he exchanged kingdoms with Megapenthes, king of Tiryns, and in course of time founded the cities of Mycenae and Mydia. The head of the Medusa he presented to his divine patroness Pallas Athene, who placed it in the centre of her shield. Many great heroes were descended from Perseus and Andromeda, foremost among whom was Heracles, whose mother, Alcmene, was their granddaughter. Heroic honours were paid to Perseus not only throughout Argos, but also at Athens and in the island of Seriphus. End of section 22.
Chapter 23. Legends. Ion and Daedalus and Icarus. Ion. Ion was the son of Creusa, the beauteous daughter of Erechtheus, king of Athens, and the sun god Phoebus Apollo, to whom she was united without the knowledge of her father. Fearing the anger of Erechtheus, Creusa placed her newborn babe in a little wicker basket, and hanging some golden charms round his neck, invoked for him the protection of the gods, and concealed him in a lonely cave. Apollo, pitying his deserted child, sent Hermes to convey him to Delphi, where he deposited his charge on the steps of the temple. Next morning the Delphic priestess discovered the infant, and was so charmed by his engaging appearance that she adopted him as her own son. The young child was carefully tended and reared by his kind foster mother, and was brought up in the service of the temple, where he was entrusted with some of the minor duties of the holy edifice. And now to return to Creusa. During a war with the Euboeans, in which the latter were signally defeated, Xuthus, son of Aeolus, greatly distinguished himself on the side of the Athenians, and as a reward for his valuable services, the hand of Creusa, the king's daughter, was bestowed upon him in marriage. Their union, however, was not blessed with children, and as this was a source of great grief to both of them, they repaired to Delphi in order to consult the great oracle. The response was, that Xuthus should regard the first person who met him on leaving the sanctuary as his son. Now, it happened that Ion, the young guardian of the temple, was the first to greet his view, and when Xuthus beheld the beautiful youth he gladly welcomed him as his son, declaring that the gods had sent him to be a blessing and comfort to his old age. Creusa, however, who concluded that the youth was the offspring of a secret marriage on the part of her husband, was filled with suspicion and jealousy. When an old servant, observing her grief, begged her to be comforted, assuring her that the cause of her distress should be speedily removed. When, upon the occasion of the public adoption of his son, Xuthus gave a grand banquet, the old servant of Creusa contrived to mix a strong poison in the wine of the unsuspecting Ion. But the youth, according to the pious custom of the ancients of offering a libation to the gods before partaking of any repast, poured upon the ground a portion of the wine before putting it to his lips, when suddenly, as if by a miracle, a dove flew into the banquet hall, and sipped of the wine of the libation, whereupon the poor little creature began to quiver in every limb, and in a few moments expired. Ion's suspicions at once fell upon the obsequious servant of Creusa, who with such officious attention had filled his cup. He violently seized the old man, and accused him of his murderous intentions. Unprepared for this sudden attack, he admitted his guilt, but pointed to the wife of Xuthus as the instigator of the crime. Ion was about to avenge himself upon Creusa, when, by means of the divine intervention of Apollo, his foster mother, the Delphic priestess, appeared on the scene, and explained the true relationship which existed between Creusa and Ion. In order to set all doubts at rest, she produced the charms which she had found round the neck of the infant, and also the wicker basket in which he had been conveyed to Delphi. Mother and son now became reconciled to each other, and Creusa revealed to Ion the secret of his divine origin. The priestess of Delphi foretold that he would become the father of a great nation, called after him the Ionians, and also that Xuthus and Creusa would have a son called Doris, who would be the progenitor of the Dorian people, both of which predictions were in due time verified. Daedalus and Icarus. Daedalus, a descendant of Erechtheus, was an Athenian architect, sculptor, and mechanician. He was the first to introduce the art of sculpture in its higher development, for before his time statues were merely rude representations, having the limbs altogether undefined. But great as was his genius, still greater was his vanity, and he could brook no rival. Now his nephew and pupil, Talus, exhibited great talent, having invented both the saw and the compass, and Daedalus, fearing lest he might overshadow his own fame, secretly killed him by throwing him down from the citadel of Pallas Athene. The murder being discovered, Daedalus was summoned before the court of the Areopagus and condemned to death, but he made his escape to the island of Crete, where he was received by King Minos in a manner worthy of his great reputation. Daedalus constructed for the king the world-renowned labyrinth, which was an immense building, full of intricate passages, intersecting each other in such a manner that even Daedalus himself is said, upon one occasion, to have nearly lost his way in it, and it was in this building the king placed the Minotaur, a monster with the head and shoulders of a bull and the body of a man. In the course of time, the great artist became weary of his long exile, more especially as the king, under the guise of friendship, kept him almost a prisoner. He therefore resolved to make his escape, and for this purpose ingeniously contrived wings for himself and his young son Icarus, whom he diligently trained how to use them. Having awaited a favourable opportunity, father and son commenced their flight, and were well on their way when Icarus, pleased with the novel sensation, forgot altogether his father's oft-repeated injunction not to approach too near the sun. The consequence was that the wax, by means of which his wings were attached, melted, and he fell into the sea and was drowned. The body of the unfortunate Icarus was washed up by the tide, and was buried by the bereaved father on an island which he called after his son, Icaria. After this sad event, Daedalus winged his flight to the island of Sicily, where he met with a kind welcome from King Cocalus, for whom he constructed several important public works. But no sooner did Minos receive the intelligence that his great architect had found an asylum with Cocalus than he sailed over to Sicily with a large army, and sent messengers to the Sicilian king demanding the surrender of his guest. Cocalus feigned compliance and invited Minos to his palace, where he was treacherously put to death in a warm bath. The body of their king was brought to Agrigent by the Cretans, where it was buried with great pomp, and over his tomb a temple to Aphrodite was erected. Daedalus passed the remainder of his life tranquilly in the island of Sicily, where he occupied himself in the construction of various beautiful works of art. End of section 23.
Section 24 of Myths and Legends. The Argonauts. Aeson, king of Iolcus, was forced to fly from his dominions, which had been usurped by his younger brother Pelias, and with difficulty succeeded in saving the life of his young son Jason, who was at that time only 10 years of age. He entrusted him to the care of the centaur Chiron, by whom he was carefully trained in company with other noble youths, who, like himself, afterwards signalized themselves by their bravery and heroic exploits. For 10 years Jason remained in the cave of the centaur, by whom he was instructed in all useful and warlike arts. But as he approached manhood, he became filled with an unconquerable desire to regain his paternal inheritance. He therefore took leave of his kind friend and preceptor, and set out for Iolcus to demand from his uncle Pelias the kingdom which he had so unjustly usurped. In the course of his journey he came to a broad and foaming river, on the banks of which he perceived an old woman, who implored him to help her across. At first he hesitated, knowing that even alone he would find some difficulty in stemming the fierce torrent, but, pitying her forlorn condition, he raised her in his arms and succeeded, with a great effort, in reaching the opposite shore. But as soon as her feet had touched the earth she became transformed into a beautiful woman, who, looking kindly at the bewildered youth, informed him that she was the goddess Hera, and that she would henceforth guide and protect him throughout his career. She then disappeared, and, full of hope and courage at his divine manifestation, Jason pursued his journey. He now perceived that, in crossing the river, he had lost one of his sandals, but as it could not be recovered, he was obliged to proceed without it. On his arrival at Iolcus, he found his uncle in the marketplace, offering up a public sacrifice to Poseidon. When the king had concluded his offering, his eye fell upon the distinguished stranger, whose manly beauty and heroic bearing had already attracted the attention of his people. Observing that one foot was unshod, he was reminded of an oracular prediction which foretold to him the loss of his kingdom by a man wearing only one sandal. He, however, disguised his fears, conversed kindly with the youth, and drew from him his name and errand. Then, pretending to be highly pleased with his nephew, Pelias entertained him sumptuously for 5 days, during which time all was festivity and rejoicing. On the 6th, Jason appeared before his uncle, and with manly firmness demanded from him the throne and kingdom which were his by right. Pelias, dissembling his true feelings, smilingly consented to grant his request, provided that in return Jason would undertake an expedition for him which his advanced age prevented him from accomplishing himself. He informed his nephew that the shade of Phrixus had appeared to him in his dreams, and entreated him to bring back from Colchis his mortal remains and the golden fleece, and added that if Jason succeeded in obtaining for him these sacred relics, throne, kingdom, and scepter would be his. Story of the Golden Fleece. Athamas, king of Boeotia, had married Nephele, a cloud nymph, and their children were Helle and Phrixus. The restless and wandering nature of Nephele, however, soon wearied her husband, who, being a mortal, had little sympathy with his ethereal consort. So he divorced her and married the beautiful but wicked Ino, sister of Semele, who hated her stepchildren and even planned their destruction. But the watchful Nephele contrived to circumvent her cruel designs, and succeeded in getting the children out of the palace. She then placed them both on the back of a winged ram with a fleece of pure gold, which had been given to her by Hermes, and on this wonderful animal brother and sister rode through the air over land and sea. But on the way Helle, becoming seized with giddiness, fell into the sea, called after her the Hellespont, and was drowned. Phrixus arrived safely at Colchis, where he was hospitably received by King Aetes, who gave him one of his daughters in marriage. In gratitude to Zeus for the protection accorded him during his flight, Phrixus sacrificed to him the golden ram, whilst the fleece he presented to Aetes, who nailed it up in the grove of Ares, and dedicated it to the god of war. An oracle having declared that the life of Aetes depended on the safe keeping of the fleece, he carefully guarded the entrance to the grove by placing before it an immense dragon which never slept. Building and launch of the Argo. We will now return to Jason, who eagerly undertook the perilous expedition proposed to him by his uncle, who, well aware of the dangers attending such an enterprise, hoped by this means to rid himself forever of the unwelcome intruder. Jason accordingly began to arrange his plans without delay, and invited the young heroes whose friendship he had formed whilst under the care of Chiron to join him in the perilous expedition. None refused the invitation, all feeling honored at being allowed the privilege of taking part in so noble and heroic an undertaking. Jason now applied to Argos, one of the cleverest shipbuilders of this time, who, under the guidance of Pallas Athene, built for him a splendid 50-oared galley, which was called the Argo after the builder. In the upper deck of the vessel the goddess had embedded a board from the speaking oak of the oracle of Zeus at Dodona, which ever retained its powers of prophecy. The exterior of the ship was ornamented with magnificent carvings, and the whole vessel was so strongly built that it defied the power of the winds and waves, and was, nevertheless, so light that the heroes, when necessary, were able to carry it on their shoulders. When the vessel was completed, the Argonauts, so called after their ship, assembled, and their places were distributed by lot. Jason was appointed commander-in-chief of the expedition. Typhus acted as steersman, Lynceus as pilot. In the bow of the vessel sat the renowned hero Heracles. In the stern, Peleus, father of Achilles, and Telamon, the father of Ajax the Great. In the inner space were Castor and Pollux, Neleus, the father of Nestor, Admetus, the husband of Alcestis, Meleager, the slayer of the Caledonian boar, Orpheus, the renowned singer, Menoctius, the father of Patroclus, Theseus, afterwards king of Athens, and his friend Pirithous, the son of Ixion, Hylas, the adopted son of Heracles, Euphemus, the son of Poseidon, Oileus, father of Ajax the Lesser, Zetes and Calais, the winged sons of Boreas, Idaman the seer, the son of Apollo, Mopsus, the Thessalian prophet, etc., etc. before their departure, Jason offered a solemn sacrifice to Poseidon and all the other sea deities. He also invoked the protection of Zeus and the Fates, and then, Mopsus having taken the auguries and found them auspicious, the heroes stepped on board. And now, a favorable breeze having sprung up, they take their allotted places, the anchor is weighed, and the ship glides like a bird out of the harbor into the waters of the great sea. Arrival at Lemnos. The Argo, with her brave crew of 50 heroes, was soon out of sight, and the sea breeze only wafted to the shore a faint echo of the sweet strains of Orpheus. For a time all went smoothly, but the vessel was soon driven by stress of weather to take refuge in a harbor in the island of Lemnos. This island was inhabited by women only, who the year before, in a fit of mad jealousy, had killed all the male population of the island, with the exception of the father of the queen, Hypsipyle. As the protection of their island now devolved upon themselves, they were always on the lookout for danger. When, therefore, they sighted the Argo from afar, they armed themselves and rushed to the shore, determined to repel any invasion of their territory. On arriving in port, the Argonauts, astonished at beholding an armed crowd of women, dispatched a herald in one of their boats, bearing the staff of peace and friendship. Hypsipyle, the queen, proposed that food and presents should be sent to the strangers in order to prevent their landing, but her old nurse, who stood beside her, suggested that this would be a good opportunity to provide themselves with noble husbands, who would act as their defenders, and thus put an end to their constant fears. Hypsipyle listened attentively to the advice of her nurse, and after some consultation decided to invite the strangers into the city. Robed in his purple mantle, the gift of Pallas Athene, Jason, accompanied by some of his companions, stepped on shore, where he was met by a deputation consisting of the most beautiful of the Lemnian women, and, as commander of the expedition, was invited into the palace of the queen. When he appeared before Hypsipyle, she was so struck with his godlike and heroic presence that she presented him with her father's scepter and invited him to seat himself on the throne beside her. Jason thereupon took up his residence in the royal castle, whilst his companions scattered themselves through the town, spending their time in feasting and pleasure. Heracles, with a few chosen comrades, also remained on board. From day to day their departure was delayed, and the Argonauts, in their new life of dissipation, had almost forgotten the object of the expedition, when Heracles suddenly appeared amongst them, and at last recalled them to a sense of their duty. Giants and Doliones. The Argonauts now pursued their voyage till contrary winds drove them toward an island inhabited by the Doliones, whose king Cyzicus received them with great kindness and hospitality. The Doliones were descendants of Poseidon, who protected them against the frequent attacks of their fierce and formidable neighbors, the earth-born giants, monsters with 6 arms. Whilst his companions were attending a banquet given by King Cyzicus, Heracles, who as usual had remained behind to guard the ship, observed that these giants were busy blocking up the harbor with huge rocks. He at once realized the danger, and attacking them with his arrows, succeeded in considerably thinning their numbers. Then, assisted by the heroes, who at length came to his aid, he effectually destroyed the remainder. The Argo now steered out of the harbor and set sail, but in consequence of a severe storm which arose at night, was driven back once more to the shores of the kindly Doliones. Unfortunately, however, owing to the darkness of the night, the inhabitants failed to recognize their former guests, and mistaking them for enemies, commenced to attack them. Those who had so recently parted as friends were now engaged in mortal combat, and in the battle which ensued Jason himself pierced to the heart his friend King Cyzicus, whereupon the Doliones, being deprived of their leader, fled to their city and closed the gates. When morning dawned and both sides perceived their error, they were filled with the deepest sorrow and remorse, and for 3 days the heroes remained with the Doliones, celebrating the funeral rites of the slain with every demonstration of mourning and solemnity. Heracles left behind. The Argonauts once more set sail, and after a stormy voyage arrived at Mysia, where they were hospitably received by the inhabitants, who spread before them plentiful banquets and sumptuously regaled them. While his friends were feasting, Heracles, who had declined to join them, went into the forest to seek a fir tree which he required for an oar, and was missed by his adopted son Hylas, who set out to seek him. When the youth arrived at a spring in the most secluded part of the forest, the nymph of the fountain was so struck by his beauty that she drew him down beneath the waters, and he was seen no more. Polyphemus, one of the heroes, who happened to be also in the forest, heard his cry for help, and on meeting Heracles informed him of the circumstance. They at once set out in search of the missing youth, no traces of whom were to be found, and whilst they were engaged looking for him, the Argo set sail and left them behind. The ship had proceeded some distance before the absence of Heracles was observed. Some of the heroes were in favor of returning for him, others wished to proceed on their journey, when, in the midst of a dispute, the sea god Glaucus arose from the waves and informed them that it was the will of Zeus that Heracles, having another mission to perform, should remain behind. The Argonauts continued their voyage without their companions. Heracles returned to Argos, whilst Polyphemus remained with the Mysians, where he founded a city and became its king. Contest with Amycus. Next morning the Argo touched at the country of the Bebrycians, whose king Amycus was a famous pugilist, and permitted no strangers to leave his shores without matching their strength with his. When the heroes therefore demanded permission to land, they were informed that they could only do so provided that one of their number should engage in a boxing match with the king. Pollux, who was the best pugilist in Greece, was selected as their champion, and a contest took place which, after a tremendous struggle, proved fatal to Amycus, who had hitherto been victorious in all similar encounters. Phineus and the Harpies. They now proceeded towards Bithynia, where reigned the blind old prophet king Phineus, son of Agenor. Phineus had been punished by the gods with premature old age and blindness for having abused the gift of prophecy. He was also tormented by the Harpies, who swooped down upon his food, which they either devoured or so defiled as to render it unfit to be eaten. This poor old man, trembling with the weakness of age and faint with hunger, appeared before the Argonauts and implored their assistance against these fiendish tormentors, whereupon Cetes and Calais, the winged sons of Boreas, recognizing in him the husband of their sister Cleopatra, affectionately embraced him and promised to rescue him from his painful position. The heroes prepared a banquet on the seashore, to which they invited Phineus, but no sooner had he taken his place than the Harpies appeared and devoured all the viands. Cetes and Calais now rose up into the air, drove the Harpies away, and were pursuing them with drawn swords, when Iris, the swift-footed messenger of the gods, appeared, and desired them to desist from their work of vengeance, promising that Phineus should be no longer molested. Freed at length from his tormentors, the old man sat down and enjoyed a plentiful repast with his kind friends the Argonauts, who now informed him of the object of their voyage. In gratitude for his deliverance, Phineus gave them much useful information concerning their journey, and not only warned them of the manifold dangers awaiting them, but also instructed them how they might be overcome. Passage of the Symplegades. After a fortnight's sojourn in Bithynia, the Argonauts once more set sail, but had not proceeded far on their course when they heard a fearful and tremendous crash. This was caused by the meeting of two great rocky islands, called the Symplegades, which floated about in the sea and constantly met and separated. Before leaving Bithynia, the blind old seer Phineus had informed them that they would be compelled to pass between these two terrible rocks, and he instructed them how to do so with safety. As they now approached the scene of danger, they remembered his advice and acted upon it. Typhus, the steersman, stood at the helm, whilst Ephemus held in his hand a dove, ready to be let loose. For Phineus had told them that if the dove ventured to fly through, they might safely follow. Ephemus now dispatched the bird, which passed swiftly through the islands, yet not without losing some of the feathers of her tail, so speedily did they reunite. Seizing the moment when the rocks once more separated, the Argonauts worked at their oars with all their might, and achieved the perilous passage in safety. After the miraculous passage of the Argo, the Symplegades became permanently united and attached to the bottom of the sea. The Stymphalides. The Argo pursued her course along the southern coast of the Pontus, and arrived at the islands of Aretius, which was inhabited by birds, who, as they flew through the air, discharged from their wings feathers sharp as arrows. As the ship was gliding along, Oileus was wounded by one of these birds, whereupon the Argonauts held a council, and by the advice of Amphidamas, an experienced hero, all put on their helmets and held up their glittering shields, uttering at the same time such fearful cries that the birds flew away in terror, and the Argonauts were enabled to land with safety on the island. Here they found 4 shipwrecked youths, who proved to be the sons of Phryx, and were greeted by Jason as his cousins. On ascertaining the object of the expedition, they volunteered to accompany the Argo, and to show the heroes the way to Colchis. They also informed them that the Golden Fleece was guarded by a fearful dragon, that King Aetes was extremely cruel, and, as the son of Apollo, was possessed of superhuman strength. Arrival at Colchis. Taking with them the 4 newcomers, they journeyed on, and soon came in sight of the snow-capped peaks of the Caucasus, when towards evening the loud flapping of wings was heard overhead. It was the giant eagle of Prometheus, on his way to torture the noble and long-suffering Titan, whose fearful groans soon afterwards fell upon their ears. That night they reached their journey's end, and anchored in the smooth waters of the river Phasis. On the left bank of this river they beheld Ceuta, the capital of Colchis, and on their right a wide field and the sacred grove of Ares, where the Golden Fleece, suspended from a magnificent oak tree, was glittering in the sun. Jason now filled a golden cup with wine, and offered a libation to Mother Earth, the gods of the country, and the shades of those of the heroes who had died on the voyage. Next morning a council was held, in which it was decided that before resorting to forcible measures, kind and conciliatory overtures should first be made to King Aetes, in order to induce him to resign the Golden Fleece. It was arranged that Jason, with a few chosen companions, should proceed to the royal castle, leaving the remainder of the crew to guard the Argo. Accompanied therefore by Telamon and Augeas, and the 4 sons of Phryxus, he set out for the palace. When they arrived in sight of the castle, they were struck by the vastness and massiveness of the building, at the entrance to which sparkling fountains played in the midst of luxuriant and park-like gardens. Here the king's daughters, Chalciope and Medea, who were walking in the grounds of the palace, met them. The former, to her great joy, recognized in the youths who accompanied the hero her own long-lost sons, whom she had mourned as dead, whilst the young and lovely Medea was struck with the noble and manly form of Jason. The news of the return of the sons of Phryxus soon spread through the palace, and brought Aeetes himself to the scene, whereupon the strangers were presented to him, and were invited to a banquet which the king ordered to be prepared in their honor. All the most beautiful ladies of the court were present at this entertainment, but in the eyes of Jason none could compare with the king's daughter, the young and lovely Medea. When the banquet was ended, Jason related to the king his various adventures, and also the object of his expedition, with the circumstances which had led to his undertaking it. Aeetes listened in silent indignation to this recital, and then burst out into a torrent of invectives against the Argonauts and his grandchildren, declaring that the fleece was his rightful property, and that on no consideration would he consent to relinquish it. Jason, however, with mild and persuasive words, contrived so far to conciliate him that he was induced to promise that if the heroes could succeed in demonstrating their divine origin by the performance of some task requiring superhuman power, the fleece should be theirs. The task proposed by Aeetes to Jason was that he should yoke the two brazen-footed, fire-breathing oxen of the king, which had been made for him by Hephaestus, to his ponderous iron plough. Having done this, he must till with them the stony fields of Ares, and then sow in the furrows the poisonous teeth of a dragon, from which armed men would rise. These he must destroy to a man, or he himself would perish at their hands. When Jason heard what was expected of him, his heart for a moment sank within him, but he determined, nevertheless, not to flinch from his task, but to trust to the assistance of the gods, and to his own courage and energy. Jason ploughs the field of Ares. Accompanied by his two friends Telamon and Augeas, and also by Argus, the son of Chalciope, Jason returned to the vessel for the purpose of holding a consultation as to the best means of accomplishing these perilous feats. Argus explained to Jason all the difficulties of the superhuman task which lay before him, and pronounced it as his opinion that the only means by which success was possible was to enlist the assistance of the Princess Medea, who was a priestess of Hecate and a great enchantress. His suggestion meeting with approval, he returned to the palace, and by the aid of his mother an interview was arranged between Jason and Medea, which took place at an early hour next morning in the temple of Hecate. A confession of mutual attachment took place, and Medea, trembling for her lover's safety, presented him with a magic salve which possessed the property of rendering any person anointed with it invulnerable for the space of 1 day against fire and steel, and invincible against any adversary, however powerful. With this salve she instructed him to anoint his spear and shield on the day of his great undertaking. She further added that when, after having ploughed the field and sown the teeth, armed men should arise from the furrows, he must on no account lose heart, but remember to throw among them a huge rock, over the possession of which they would fight amongst themselves, and their attention being thus diverted, he would find it an easy task to destroy them. Overwhelmed with gratitude, Jason thanked her in the most earnest manner for her wise counsel and timely aid. At the same time he offered her his hand, and promised her he would not return to Greece without taking her with him as his wife. Next morning Aeetes, in all the pomp of state, surrounded by his family and the members of his court, repaired to a spot whence a full view of the approaching spectacle could be obtained. Soon Jason appeared in the field of Ares, looking as noble and majestic as the god of war himself. In a distant part of the field the brazen yokes and the massive plough met his view, but as yet the dread animals themselves were nowhere to be seen. He was about to go in quest of them when they suddenly rushed out from a subterranean cave, breathing flames of fire and enveloped in a thick smoke. The friends of Jason trembled, but the undaunted hero, relying on the magic powers with which he was imbued by Medea, seized the oxen one after the other by the horns and forced them to the yoke. Near the plough was a helmet full of dragon's teeth, which he sowed as he ploughed the field, whilst with sharp pricks from his lance he compelled the monstrous creatures to draw the plough over the stony ground, which was thus speedily tilled. While Jason was engaged sowing the dragon's teeth in the deep furrows of the field, he kept a cautious lookout lest the germinating giant brood might grow too quickly for him, and as soon as the 4 acres of land had been tilled, he unyoked the oxen and succeeded in frightening them so effectually with his weapons that they rushed back in terror to their subterranean stables. Meanwhile, armed men had sprung up out of the furrows, and the whole field now bristled with lances. But Jason, remembering the instructions of Medea, seized an immense rock and hurled it into the midst of these earth-born warriors, who immediately began to attack each other. Jason then rushed furiously upon them, and after a terrible struggle not one of the giants remained alive. Furious at seeing his murderous scheme thus defeated, Aeetes not only perfidiously refused to give Jason the fleece which he had so bravely earned, but in his anger determined to destroy all the Argonauts and to burn their vessel. Jason secures the golden fleece. Becoming aware of the treacherous designs of her father, Medea at once took measures to baffle them. In the darkness of night she went on board the Argo and warned the heroes of their approaching danger. She then advised Jason to accompany her without loss of time to the sacred grove in order to possess himself of the long-coveted treasure. They set out together, and Medea, followed by Jason, led the way, and advanced boldly into the grove. The tall oak tree was soon discovered, from the topmost boughs of which hung the beautiful golden fleece. At the foot of this tree, keeping his ever wakeful watch, lay the dreadful, sleepless dragon, who at sight of them bounded forward, opening his huge jaws. Medea now called into play her magic powers, and quietly approaching the monster threw over him a few drops of a potion which soon took effect and sent him into a deep sleep, whereupon Jason, seizing the opportunity, climbed the tree and secured the fleece. Their perilous task being now accomplished, Jason and Medea quitted the grove and hastened on board the Argo, which immediately put to sea. Murder of Absyrtus. Meanwhile Aeetes, having discovered the loss of his daughter and the golden fleece, dispatched a large fleet under the command of his son Absyrtus in pursuit of the fugitives. After some days' sail they arrived at an island at the mouth of the river Ister, where they found the Argo at anchor, and surrounded her with their numerous ships. They then dispatched a herald on board of her, demanding the surrender of Medea and the fleece. Medea now consulted Jason, and with his consent carried out the following stratagem. She sent a message to her brother Absyrtus to the effect that she had been carried off against her will, and promised that if he would meet her in the darkness of night in the temple of Artemis, she would assist him in regaining possession of the golden fleece. Relying on the good faith of his sister, Absyrtus fell into the snare and duly appeared at the appointed trysting place, and whilst Medea kept her brother engaged in conversation, Jason rushed forward and slew him. Then, according to a preconcerted signal, he held aloft a lighted torch, whereupon the Argonauts attacked the Colchians, put them to flight, and entirely defeated them. The Argonauts now returned to their ship, when the prophetic board from the Dodean oak thus addressed them: "The cruel murder of Absyrtus was witnessed by the Erinyes, and you will not escape the wrath of Zeus until the goddess Circe has purified you from your crime. Let Castor and Pollux pray to the gods that you may be enabled to find the abode of the sorceress." In obedience to the voice, the twin brothers invoked divine assistance, and the heroes set out in search of the Isle of Circe. They arrive at the island of Circe. The good ship Argo sped on her way, and after passing safely through the foaming waters of the river Eridanus, at length arrived in the harbor of the island of Circe, where she cast anchor. Commanding his companions to remain on board, Jason landed with Medea and conducted her to the palace of the sorceress. The goddess of charms and magic arts received them kindly and invited them to be seated, but instead of doing so they assumed a supplicating attitude and humbly besought her protection. They then informed her of the dreadful crime which they had committed, and implored her to purify them from it. This Circe promised to do. She forthwith commanded her attendant maids to kindle the fire on the altar, and to prepare everything necessary for the performance of the mystic rites, after which a dog was sacrificed and the sacred cakes were burned. Having thus duly purified the criminals, she severely reprimanded them for the horrible murder of which they had been guilty, whereupon Medea, with veiled head and weeping bitterly, was reconducted by Jason to the Argo. Further adventures of the Argonauts. Having left the island of Circe, they were wafted by gentle zephyrs towards the abode of the Sirens, whose enticing strains soon fell upon their ears. The Argonauts, powerfully affected by the melody, were making ready to land, when Orpheus perceived danger, and, to the accompaniment of his magic lyre, commenced one of his enchanting songs, which so completely absorbed his listeners that they passed the island in safety, but not before Butes, one of their number, lured by the seductive music of the Sirens, had sprung from the vessel into the waves below. Aphrodite, however, in pity for his youth, landed him gently on the island of Libyban, before the Sirens could reach him, and there he remained for many years. And now the Argonauts approached new dangers, for on one side of them seethed and foamed the whirlpool of Charybdis, whilst on the other towered the mighty rock whence the monster Scylla swooped down upon unfortunate mariners. But here the goddess Hera came to their assistance, and sent to them the sea nymph Tethys, who guided them safely through these dangerous straits. The Argo next arrived at the island of Phasis, where they were hospitably entertained by King Alcinous and his queen Arete. But the banquet prepared for them by their kind host was unexpectedly interrupted by the appearance of a large army of Colchians sent by Aeetes to demand the restoration of his daughter. Medea threw herself at the feet of the queen and implored her to save her from the anger of her father, and Arete, in her kindness of heart, promised her protection. Next morning, in an assembly of the people, at which the Colchians were invited to be present, The latter were informed that, as Medea was the lawful wife of Jason, they could not consent to deliver her up. Whereupon the Colchians, seeing that the resolution of the king was not to be shaken, and fearing to face the anger of Aeetes should they return to Colchis without her, sought permission of Alcinous to settle in his kingdom, which request was accorded them. After these events the Argonauts once more set sail, and steered for Iolcus. But in the course of a terrible and fearful night a mighty storm arose, and in the morning they found themselves stranded on the treacherous quicksands of Syrtis, on the shores of Libya. Here all was a waste and barren desert, untenanted by any living creature, save the venomous snakes which had sprung from the blood of the Medusa when borne by Perseus over these arid plains. They had already passed several days in this abode of desolation, beneath the rays of the scorching sun, and had abandoned themselves to the deepest despair, when the Libyan queen, who was a prophetess of divine origin, appeared to Jason and informed him that a sea-horse would be sent by the gods to act as his guide. Scarcely had she departed when a gigantic hippocamp was seen in the distance, making its way towards the Argo. Jason now related to his companions the particulars of his interview with the Libyan prophetess, and after some deliberation it was decided to carry the Argo on their shoulders and to follow wherever the sea-horse should lead them. They then commenced a long and weary journey through the desert, and at last, after 12 days of severe toil and terrible suffering, the welcome sight of the sea greeted their view. In gratitude for having been saved from their manifold dangers, they offered up sacrifices to the gods, and launched their ship once more into the deep waters of the ocean. Arrival at Crete. With heartfelt joy and gladness they proceeded on their homeward voyage, and after some days arrived at the island of Crete, where they purposed to furnish themselves with fresh provisions and water. Their landing, however, was opposed by a terrible giant who guarded the island against all intruders. This giant, whose name was Talus, was the last of the brazen race, and being formed of brass, was invulnerable, except in his right ankle, where there was a sinew of flesh and a vein of blood. As he saw the Argo nearing the coast, he hurled huge rocks at her, which would inevitably have sunk the vessel had not the crew beat a hasty retreat. Although sadly in want of food and water, the Argonauts had decided to proceed on their journey rather than face so powerful an opponent, when Medea came forward and assured them that if they would trust to her she would destroy the giant. Enveloped in the folds of a rich purple mantle, she stepped on deck, and after invoking the aid of the Fates, uttered a magic incantation which had the effect of throwing Talus into a deep sleep. He stretched himself at full length upon the ground, and in doing so grazed his vulnerable ankle against the point of a sharp rock, whereupon a mighty stream of blood gushed forth from the wound. Awakened by the pain, he tried to rise, but in vain, and with a mighty groan of anguish the giant fell dead, and his enormous body rolled heavily over into the deep. The heroes, being now able to land, provisioned their vessel, after which they resumed their homeward voyage. Arrival at Iolcus. After a terrible night of storm and darkness, they passed the island of Aegina, and at length reached in safety the port of Iolcus, where the recital of their numerous adventures and hairbreadth escapes was listened to with wondering admiration by their fellow countrymen. The Argo was consecrated to Poseidon, and was carefully preserved for many generations till no vestige of it remained, when it was placed in the heavens as a brilliant constellation. On his arrival at Iolcus, Jason conducted his beautiful bride to the palace of his uncle Pelias, taking with him the golden fleece, for the sake of which this perilous expedition had been undertaken. But the old king, who had never expected that Jason would return alive, basely refused to fulfill his part of the compact and declined to abdicate the throne. Indignant at the wrongs of her husband, Medea avenged them in a most shocking manner. She made friends with the daughters of the king, and feigned great interest in all their concerns. Having gained their confidence, she informed them that, among her numerous magic arts, she possessed the power of restoring to the aged all the vigor and strength of youth, and in order to give them a convincing proof of the truth of her assertion, she cut up an old ram, which she boiled in a cauldron, whereupon, after uttering various mystic incantations, there came forth from the vessel a beautiful young lamb. She then assured them that in a similar manner they could restore to their old father his former youthful frame and vigor. The fond and credulous daughters of Pelias lent an all too willing ear to the wicked sorceress, and thus the old king perished at the hands of his innocent children. Death of Jason. Medea and Jason now fled to Corinth, where at length they found for a time peace and tranquillity, their happiness being completed by the birth of 3 children. As time passed on, however, and Medea began to lose the beauty which had won the love of her husband, he grew weary of her, and became attracted by the youthful charms of Glauce, the beautiful daughter of Creon, king of Corinth. Jason had obtained her father's consent to their union, and the wedding day was already fixed, before he disclosed to Medea the treachery which he meditated against her. He used all his persuasive powers in order to induce her to consent to his union with Glauce, assuring her that his affection had in no way diminished, but that for the sake of the advantages which would thereby accrue to their children, he had decided on forming this alliance with the royal house. Though justly enraged at his deceitful conduct, Medea dissembled her wrath, and feigning to be satisfied with this explanation, sent as a wedding gift to her rival a magnificent robe of cloth of gold. This robe was imbued with a deadly poison, which penetrated to the flesh and bone of the wearer, and burned them as though with a consuming fire. Pleased with the beauty and costliness of the garment, the unsuspecting Glauce lost no time in donning it, but no sooner had she done so than the fell poison began to take effect. In vain she tried to tear the robe away; it defied all efforts to be removed, and after horrible and protracted sufferings she expired. Maddened at the loss of her husband's love, Medea next put to death her 3 sons, and when Jason, thirsting for revenge, left the chamber of his dead bride, and flew to his own house in search of Medea, the ghastly spectacle of his murdered children met his view. He rushed frantically to seek the murderess, but nowhere could she be found. At length, hearing a sound above his head, he looked up and beheld Medea gliding through the air in a golden chariot drawn by dragons. In a fit of despair, Jason threw himself on his own sword, and perished on the threshold of his desolate and deserted home. End of section 24.